evolutionary spirituality is making an important contribution. My teachers are all what I would call evolutionary mystics, a term that's been used in the academic scholarship of Hebrew mysticism by a number of people. Evolutionary mysticism, right, is the sense that I'm participating in the evolving all. I'm participating in the evolving process. Now, it might be fair to say, and we actually coined this term in a beautiful conversation between myself and Ken Wilber and Andrew Cohen. It was a phone conversation, a private conversation, which we were talking about the relationship between the earlier evolutionary cast and thinking and impulse in Kabbalah and contemporary evolutionary spirituality. What emerged in that conversation is we called Kabbalah a kind of proto-evolutionary spirituality, right? Proto because actually at the time when the great Kabbalists were writing the key evolutionary tracts, which are later phases of the Zohar in the 13th century, which are the key teachings of Luria in the Renaissance, at that moment, the notion of the biosphere, the physical world evolving the way we understand it today, actually wasn't in play. There were glimmers of the idea here and there in the most esoteric of texts, but there was no empirical evidence for it, and it wasn't really in consciousness at all. It comes into consciousness, in the 100 years before Darwin, and Darwin crystallizes it, right, and explodes it into the public culture as one of the four great ideas, the last, 200 years. So clearly, evolution itself is evolving. Clearly, we're understanding more deeply today that all levels of reality are evolving. Having said that, the basic notion that spirit's evolving, and that something new emerges, and that there's an evolution of divinity itself, right, is a core feature, right, of Lurianic thought. My colleague in Jerusalem, who I haven't spoken to in many years, who wrote a fantastic doctorate on Luria, right, quotes Nikos Kazantzakis, right, to summarize Luria's doctrine of the evolution of God. Right, and Nikos Kazantzakis writes, "We are the saviors of God." And what he means by that is, right, what Menachem Kallis, who wrote the doctorate, means in citing Kazantzakis is that God is evolving. Right, there's something new that's created that didn't exist before. Right, there's an evolution of divinity. And from a non-dual Lurianic Kabbalistic perspective, meaning from a perspective of the deep understanding of the interior face of essential reality, the human being is an inextricable part of the divine. There's no separation. And the human being participates through his or her own evolving of consciousness in evolving the divine, in evolving the divine consciousness. That idea is a core idea. So as a trained Kabbalist who's received and drunk from the lineage of Kabbalah, the notion of an evolutionary context is core to the way I think about the world. It's core to what you might call my mental furniture. It's an absolute given. And clearly, evolution itself evolved through Darwin, and people like Aurobindo, right, in the Hindu tradition, and later the Jesuit Desjardins, right, articulated, and Abraham Cook, right, whose writing dies about 30 years before Desjardins is at his height, or 20 years before. Abraham Cook, the first chief rabbi of Israel, and dies in 1938, write extensively and develop extensively this notion of the evolving nature of reality, and particularly the evolving nature of spirit. Both Cook and Aurobindo are really parallel figures, one in Kabbalah, the other in Hinduism. Desjardins, right, who writes after them and emerges in some sense in their wake, particularly Desjardins is in the wake of Aurobindo, right, further articulate the idea. They deepen the idea. And once you have the evolution of the biosphere at play, of course, the game changes. Having said that, and having really recognized the importance of the evolutionary moment, of living in an evolutionary context, which is core to an awakened, unique self, let me also point out the limitation of some of the ways that evolutionary spirituality has expressed itself in the world. And the first is its initial expression, right, in Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, that school of German idealism, it actually produced a vision of the world that in some sense became a kernel of the worst forms of oppression that were ever created. Right? The dialectical materialism that comes out of Hegel becomes, in distorted form, of course, a kernel of both communism and Nazism. The two between them, right, managed to kill brutally 100 million non-combatants, right, in the most horrific of ways. Right? Because what they did is, right, they elevated the process above the personal. The evolutionary process, the impersonal evolutionary process, awakening to the impersonal evolutionary process, became the essential movement in a human being's awakening. And that is, to say the least, problematic. The second we lose the irreducible dignity of every individual human being, and the irreducible dignity of the individual human being is sourced in their uniqueness. Uniqueness is the source of dignity, the irreplaceability of every human being, right? Then we're in big trouble. Then there's a slippery slope down into, right, the most brutal forms of human depravity. And so I'm always hesitant, right? I'm always wary when I hear, right, certain ways that evolutionary spirituality is championed in the world, in which the impersonal seems to trump the personal, right? In which the process seems to trump the irreducible significance of the individualized human being, and I get wary. And my tradition, right, my lineage tradition that I'm sourced in, is wary. Right? There always needs to be a complete dialectical tension, right, between the infinite value and dignity and adequacy of the individual and the infinite adequacy, dignity, and existence of the community. And community and individual always need to be in play with each other. So part of the dharma of unique self, right, is to realize that actually you can never lose sight of that irreducibly unique human being. Now, of course, let's be very clear. The same way that a doctrine of unique self can't take responsibility for the hyper-narcissism of the Western world, for the hyper-greed, right, of certain capitalistic expressions, not genuine capitalism, but what John Mackey's called crony capitalism, right, just run on a kind of greed and a kind of just insane, hyper-inflated, narcissistic inflation, right? The same way you can't hold unique self responsible for that, right? Because that's a distortion of unique self. You can't hold, right, unique self responsible for all of the egoic distortions in the world. Obviously, you can't hold evolutionary spirituality, right, responsible for all its distortions in the world. Each one needs to be wary of its own shadows. And let me perhaps end this with a story. It's a beautiful story of Levi Isaac of Berdichev, who is a great non-dual realized master in the Hasidic tradition, who is leading the prayer services on the High Holy Days. And in the prayer services on the High Holy Days, particularly on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the Day of At-One-ment, right? The holiest day in the Hebrew calendar is, by its nature, a day of tikkun. And tikkun means fixing, but more precisely in Kabbalah it means evolving. Right? Avram Leder, an excellent scholar of the Zohar, has pointed out that the word tikkun in a particular strata of the Zohar, called the Tikkunei Zohar, is accurately translated as the evolving Godhead. Not the fixing of the Godhead, but the evolving of the Godhead. So in this notion of evolving, in this deep notion of the evolving Godhead, right, on Yom Kippur, the human being participates in evolving the Godhead. So who does that for the community? The master who leads the community in prayer. In this Kabbalistic understanding, which animated Levi Isaac of Berdichev, as he led the community in prayer on Yom Kippur, he was literally fixing, tikkuning, evolving the inner face of the Godhead. And he's weaving through all of Yom Kippur, and there's 5 major prayer services, 5 major recensions of evolution of God that take place. And he's now in the 5th and highest one. And he's so ecstatic. He's so on the inside of the inside. He's so in the deepest of the deep. He's so participating audaciously in the evolution of God and the healing of reality that even though the fast's over, the fast has been over for 10, 15, 20 minutes, he's still on the inside and he's about to do the final healing. He's about to make the movement of the final evolution that will fix all and will unleash full freedom and full compassion and full justice in the land. And as he's about to, with his mystical activism, move the final screws, turn the final screws in this mystical evolution of the divine, he sees out of the corner of his eye that there's an old man who's thirsty. He's thirsty because he just can't quite make it. This extra 20 minutes at the end of the fast is too much for him. He needs to drink. And immediately, Levi Isaac of Berdichev descends from all worlds, ends the fast, stops in place the evolutionary movement, pours a glass of water, and brings it to the old man. When I first heard that story, I burst out in tears. The utter beauty of knowing that to bring a glass of water to an old man trumps the very evolutionary movement of the cosmos. Because that old man is irreducibly unique. He's of infinite value and infinite significance. And that's the unique self invitation to evolutionary spirituality. And as those two ideas come together and influence and affect each other, right, as the teachers of evolutionary spirituality lend to unique self a deeper awareness of the evolutionary context and awaken the unique self teachers in a very deep way to very important terms like ecstatic urgency, which my friend Andrew Cohen uses beautifully. And as unique self teachers give to the evolutionary spirituality conversation terms that I've developed in the world, myself, Ken, like unique perspective. And Andrew very beautifully used that term in the beginning of his book, a little blue book that came out a couple of years ago, whose name escapes me, right? A beautiful book on the evolutionary spirituality teaching. And he talks in the introduction, or his student talks about this being an expression of his unique perspective. So we actually share Dharma with each other. Because we're deeply committed to the Dharma, we've evolved, thank God, beyond identification with ego, and we're serving the teaching. We're serving the process as individualized expressions of the heart, mind, body of the divine, and an ecstatic urgency finds its way right into unique self-teaching. Unique self as an expression of being and becoming. And becoming is defined by ecstatic urgency. And unique perspective, right, and this deep sense of the personal finds its way in a way that wasn't there before, right, into contemporary evolutionary spirituality teaching. And we begin to merge, right, to a higher embrace and influence each other in the ways that we should, that are appropriate. Then something happens. Then spirit dances. Then spirit becomes alive. Then ego melts. And authentic self, unique self, come online and dance together, right, to create a better tomorrow.